The story begins long before any chaos, courtrooms, or neighborhood arguments. It starts in a calm and simple way, the main character stepping into a new chapter of life that seemed peaceful from the outside. They had recently moved into a neighborhood that looked quiet, calm, full of friendly people who waved at strangers and greeted each other with warm smiles. For the main character, this place felt like the fresh start they had quietly wished for. The neighborhood was lined with clean sidewalks, neatly trimmed gardens, and houses painted in soft colors. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had a warm, comforting feel, the kind of place where people believed they would build a stable and settled life. Every morning, the soft sound of birds filled the air, mixing with the gentle rhythms of everyday life. Children played on their bikes, neighbors watered their plants, and elderly couples sat outside enjoying the slow afternoon breeze. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. The main character chose this place because they wanted peace. They wanted a home where they could wake up every day without stress and build a routine that felt steady. Life had been busy before, full of responsibilities and noise, so this move felt like an escape into something softer and kinder. At first, everything went exactly as expected. The neighbors were welcoming. People waved, introduced themselves, and even brought small gifts to say hello. The main character felt grateful. They believed they had finally found a place where life would move smoothly. But life has a strange way of hiding its storms behind clear skies. The first time the main character encountered the HOA president, things seemed normal. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She spoke with confidence, explaining the rules, the responsibilities, and the expectations of the community. It sounded strict, but manageable. The main character listened politely, nodding along, not realizing how important this meeting would become later. At first, the HOA president seemed helpful, giving advice on where to find local services, sharing contact numbers, and explaining how monthly meetings worked. The main character thanked her and didn't think too much about it. After all, neighborhoods often had someone in charge. It wasn't unusual, but it didn't take long before small things began to feel different. One morning, the main character found a note taped to their door. It said something about a minor issue, nothing serious. It's just a comment about the placement of a small pot near the front porch. The main character read it, shrugged, and moved the pot slightly. It wasn't a big deal. A few days later, another note appeared. Then another. Each one pointed out something tiny, something almost invisible, like the color of a garden light or the height of grass that wasn't even overgrown. The tone of each note felt sharp, cold, and unnecessarily strict. Still, the main character stayed polite. They didn't want to start their journey here with tension, but the notes didn't stop. One afternoon, the HOA president showed up unannounced. She stood with a clipboard in hand, pointing at things around the yard and listing them as if they were major violations. The main character listened quietly, feeling a hint of confusion mixed with discomfort. None of the things she mentioned seemed serious. Some weren't even mentioned in the rulebook, but the way she spoke made them feel like they had committed something terrible. The main character apologized politely, even though they hadn't done anything truly wrong. They made changes, adjusted things, and tried their best to follow every rule they were told about. But each time they fixed one thing, a new complaint surfaced. It felt like an endless cycle. Other neighbors noticed. They would shake their heads gently, giving sympathetic smiles, as if they understood exactly what was happening, but were too afraid to say anything openly. Some whispered that the HOA president had always been too strict. She enjoyed controlling things, and once she focused on someone, she didn't stop easily. The main character tried not to overthink it. They believed patience could solve most things. They believed that maybe the president just wanted things done properly. But deep inside, a quiet question began to form. Why only me? Days turned into weeks, and the situation didn't improve. The HOA president grew more bold, leaving longer notes, sending emails, and even hinting at fines for issues that didn't exist. The main character read each message carefully, trying to remain calm. They didn't want conflict. They just wanted to enjoy their home. Despite the growing tension, the rest of the neighborhood still felt beautiful. The main character would take long walks at sunset, watching the orange sky fade into soft shades of pink and purple. Those quiet moments gave them peace. They reminded themselves that one difficult person couldn't ruin a whole life. But deep inside, they knew something wasn't right. The turning point came one afternoon, while the main character was watering the small plants near the porch. The HOA president marched up with 2 board members behind her. She didn't greet them. She didn't smile. Instead, she began pointing at the plants. The porch, the driveway listing things that she claimed were violations. The main character remained respectful, answering calmly, but a strange feeling settled inside them. For the first time, they realized this wasn't about rules. This was something personal. The president seemed determined to find fault, even where none existed. The board members standing with her looked uncomfortable, shifting their feet and avoiding eye contact. They didn't seem confident in what she was saying. One of them tried to speak, but the president silenced them with a quick glance. The message was clear. No one was allowed to question her. That day, the main character felt something shift. Not in the neighborhood, but inside themselves. They understood, maybe for the first time, that staying silent wouldn't make the problem disappear. Still, they didn't want to react with anger or accusations. Instead, they decided to observe more closely. They wanted to understand what was truly going on. The following morning, while sitting on the porch sipping a warm drink, the main character noticed something subtle. Neighbors walked by with polite smiles, but some looked nervous. Some avoided looking at the HOA president's house altogether. It was a small detail, but it told a big story. People weren't afraid of rules. They were afraid of her. Over the next few days, the main character paid attention to small interactions. They noticed how the president talked to others, how her tone changed depending on the person, how quickly she criticized, how often she monitored everyone's homes as if she owned them. The main character realized they weren't the first person to be targeted. There had been others before them. People just didn't talk about it openly because they feared the consequences. Even so, the main character didn't want to judge too quickly. They believed it was better to stay calm, understand the situation fully, and hope things would improve. But the president had other plans. One evening, right after sunset, the main character found another notice taped to the door. This one was longer and more aggressive than the previous ones. It accused them of breaking rules they had never heard of. It threatened fines. It demanded immediate action. The main character stood there silently, reading the letter again and again. A mix of frustration and disbelief washed over them. They knew something wasn't right. Something deeper was happening. And for the first time, they felt that this issue might not end quietly. They folded the letter slowly and placed it on the table, taking a deep breath. They needed to think, to understand, to plan. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful as always. Lights glowed softly from windows. The sound of quiet conversations drifted through the air. Children laughed faintly in the distance, but the main character knew the peace was only on the surface. Something in the neighborhood felt heavy, hidden behind smiles and greetings. Something that had been ignored for too long. As the main character looked around, they felt a strange sense of clarity. They didn't know how or when, or where things would shift, but they knew change was coming, whether they wanted it or not. And this was only the beginning. The days that followed were heavier than before. The main character began to notice a pattern, something hidden behind the quiet routines of the neighborhood. The HOA president wasn't just strict, she had turned her authority into something personal, something she used like a tool to control people. And for some reason, the main character had become her new focus. After the long notice she left on the door, things didn't settle down. Instead, the situation seemed to grow even more tense. The main character could feel it in the way neighbors acted around them, in the way the atmosphere shifted when the HOA president stepped outside. It felt like the air itself carried a warning. Still, the main character didn't lose their calm. They believed that maybe if they followed every rule carefully, things might improve. Maybe the president would finally stop targeting them. But the more they tried to stay compliant, the more unreasonable she became. One morning, while the main character was sweeping the front walkway, the HOA president suddenly appeared. She didn't greet them, didn't even smile. She simply pointed at the driveway and said, "This is unacceptable," without explaining what she meant. When asked politely, she listed several vague problems that didn't match any rule in the community handbook. The main character listened, nodding slowly, even though inside they felt confused. Every time she visited, she added new complaints, new expectations, new demands. None of it made sense. Neighbors watched from a distance. Their faces were filled with sympathy, but also caution. No one stepped forward to support the main character in front of the president. Later, when the president wasn't around, they whispered quiet words of encouragement. "Just ignore her. She's like that with everyone. She's been doing this for years. She doesn't like when people don't follow her way." These comments didn't make the situation easier, but they made the main character realize something important. They were not alone. Others had gone through the same trouble. Some had given up and left the neighborhood. Some stayed silent to avoid trouble. Some tried standing up but felt pressure from the board. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. The main character didn't want to jump to conclusions, though. They wanted to remain fair, calm, and respectful. Their plan was to document everything and continue being patient. But the president wasn't done. A few days later, the main character received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal HOA violation letter. It had a long list of issues, some of which had never happened. The letter even included potential fines, large ones. The main character read it several times, feeling disbelief rise in their chest. None of it was true. They walked outside to get some fresh air, hoping it would help clear their mind. As they stood on the porch, one of the older neighbors approached slowly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I saw the letter." The neighbor whispered, their voice soft, "You're not the first person she's done this to." The main character listened quietly. She changes rules whenever she wants. She adds fines that don't exist. She scares people into agreeing with her. Most of us stay quiet because it's easier than fighting back. This was the first time someone had openly admitted what was happening. The main character thanked the neighbor gently. They didn't want to involve anyone else or cause more tension, but hearing the truth made things clearer. The problem wasn't their plants or driveway or porch decorations. The problem was deeper rooted in power and misuse. Still, the main character didn't want conflict. They wanted fairness. So they decided to reach out to the HOA president through a polite email, asking for clarification about the violations and a copy of the specific rule numbers. No reply came. A day passed. 2 days, 4 days. Finally, a short response appeared in the inbox. "All rules are final. Fix everything immediately." No explanation. No details. No rulebook reference. The main character felt something tighten inside them. This wasn't normal. This wasn't fair. And it definitely wasn't something they could ignore anymore as they continued living their daily routine. The HOA president's behavior became more persistent. She would walk around the neighborhood with her clipboard, stopping near the main character's home more often than anywhere else. She would stare, take notes, and step away without a word. One afternoon, she even blocked the main character's path while they were carrying groceries from the car, demanding to know why a certain decorative item was placed on the porch. Even though it was harmless and common, the main character kept their voice calm, answering respectfully, but inside they felt frustration building. Not anger, just the exhaustion of being treated unfairly. The turning point happened near the end of the week. The main character returned home from work and found something new taped to the door. It wasn't a regular notice. It was a fine larger than anything before. The document said they had hosted a loud gathering at night, disturbing the neighborhood. But there had been no gathering, no noise, nothing. It was a complete lie. The main character stood there, holding the letter, feeling a mix of confusion and disbelief. This wasn't just strictness anymore. This was harassment. Someone was deliberately creating problems to make them look guilty. They quietly walked inside, sat down at the table, and set the fine letter beside the previous ones. A small stack was now forming, each one more unreasonable than the last. For a long moment, they simply stared at them. Then something inside clicked. This had gone too far. The main character didn't raise their voice. They didn't storm out. Instead, they calmly pulled out a folder, placed the letters inside, and began collecting every document they had received from the HOA. They took screenshots of emails. They recorded dates and times of every interaction. They even wrote down exactly what neighbors had whispered to them. They didn't want revenge. They wanted justice. The next day, the main character attended the monthly HOA meeting for the first time. It was held in a small room near the community park. They walked inside, sat down quietly, and watched how the president conducted the meeting. She spoke in a sharp tone, not letting others finish their sentences. She dismissed suggestions, cut off questions, and avoided topics she didn't like. A few people attempted to raise concerns, but she waved them off. The main character watched closely, understanding now why so many neighbors seemed afraid. The president didn't lead the HOA, she controlled it. Midway through the meeting, she paused and glared at the main character. "We need to address the violations at your property," she announced loudly. Everyone turned to look. The main character felt dozens of eyes on them, but they stayed calm. When it was their turn to speak, they politely requested copies of the rules being referenced and asked for clarification. Regarding the false accusations, the room grew quiet. The president's expression tightened. She stuttered slightly, clearly surprised by the calm and direct question. She didn't have the documents. She didn't have the rule numbers. She didn't have any proof. She responded vaguely, talking in circles, trying to shift the topic. But the board members looked confused, and a few neighbors exchanged glances. For the first time, cracks appeared in her confidence. The main character left the meeting quietly. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They simply observed and walked out with a clear mind. That night, they felt something shift, not in the neighborhood, but within themselves. They weren't scared anymore. They weren't confused. They weren't alone. They knew the truth now. The HOA president wasn't just strict. She was misusing her power. And sooner or later, the consequences would catch up. The main character looked out the window at the quiet street. The houses stood still under the soft glow of streetlights. Everything looked peaceful again, but the peace was fragile. And the storm was only beginning. Part 2 ends with the main character fully aware of what they were facing, an unfair system led by someone who believed she could never be challenged. But she was wrong. Things were about to change. The days that followed felt like a slow storm building up inside me. I kept waking up early, sometimes before the sun even touched the sky, just lying there and thinking about how everything had changed in such a short time. Even small things felt heavier now, like every sound in the house carried a different meaning. I tried to act normal, but deep down I knew I wasn't the same person anymore. And maybe that was fine. Maybe change was the only thing left to hold on to. I started spending more time outside even when I didn't have a reason to. There was something calming about stepping out into the fresh air, hearing other people's voices in the distance, watching dogs pulling their owners along the sidewalks, and seeing kids rushing around with more energy than they knew what to do with. It helped me feel grounded. It reminded me that life didn't stop just because my heart felt tight. One afternoon, I walked to the small park near the neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few benches, some trees scattered around, and a little path that looped around the grass. I liked going there because it felt open, like the world made a bit more space for me to breathe. I sat down on a bench and watched a group of teenagers playing a loud game of tag. They ran around laughing and shouting, and for a moment, I almost smiled. Their happiness felt real. It's untouched by the kind of worries adults walked around with. But then my mind drifted back to everything I had been avoiding. The unanswered questions. The uncertainty. The feeling that no matter how hard I tried, something was still slipping away. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me felt tired of trying to fix things. Tired of pretending everything was fine. Tired of carrying expectations that never really felt like mine. I stayed at the park longer than usual. I watched as people came and left. A couple sat on a bench nearby, sharing quiet conversation. An elderly man walked slowly around the loop, taking breaks every few minutes but never giving up. A woman pushed a stroller and hummed a soft melody I couldn't quite catch. Life was happening everywhere, and I felt like a quiet observer sitting on the edge of it all. When I finally got up to leave, the sky had already started to turn a warm shade of orange. I walked home slowly, not because I was physically tired, but because I wanted the walk to last. There was something comforting about moving without rushing. It gave me time to think, time to settle the noise inside my head. By the time I reached my street, my steps had grown lighter, even if nothing else had. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the small sounds the house made, the hum of the fridge, the occasional click of the cooling walls, the wind brushing softly against the windows. My thoughts kept circling, moving from one worry to another like they were stuck on an endless track. I turned on my side, then on my back again. Nothing helped. Eventually, I sat up and switched on the lamp beside my bed. The room filled with soft, warm light. I grabbed the notebook I kept in the drawer, the one I rarely used except when things felt too heavy to hold inside. The pages were mostly empty, but that night, I needed a place to put my thoughts. I didn't write anything poetic or organized. I just wrote whatever came to mind, simple words, simple feelings. I wrote about how confused I felt, how unsure I was of what would happen next, how much I wished I could understand everything in front of me. I wrote about the people around me, the things I wished I could say, the things I wished someone would say to me. I wrote until my hand felt stiff and the page looked messy but honest. When I closed the notebook, I felt a small sense of relief. Not because anything had changed, but because I had finally let some of the weight out. I turned off the lamp and rested my head on the pillow again. This time, sleep came slowly but peacefully. The next morning, I felt a little clearer. Not perfect, not completely calm, but more steady. I made myself breakfast and tried not to rush through it like I normally did. I drank my tea while looking out the window, watching the street wake up. Cars passed by. People walked their dogs. Life continued. Later that day, I got a message that surprised me. It was simple, just a few words, but somehow it felt heavier than anything I had heard all week. It made me pause, made me think, made me wonder if maybe things weren't as hopeless as I had feared. It wasn't a promise, but it felt like a small door opening, even if just a little. I spent the afternoon going about my usual tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to the message. Every time I thought about it, something inside me softened. For the first time in a while, I felt a spark of hope. Not the loud kind, not the kind that rushes in suddenly, but the quiet kind that grows slowly and gently, like a candle being lit in a dark room. In the evening, I stepped outside to take a short walk. The air was cool, and the sky was dotted with soft clouds drifting lazily overhead. I walked without a plan, letting my feet choose the direction. I ended up near the park again. It wasn't as busy this time. Only a few people were there, a young boy riding a small bike, a woman jogging with earbuds in, and a man sitting alone on a bench. Lost in his own thoughts, I walked along the path, feeling the breeze brush against my face. Every step felt lighter, like the weight I had been carrying was slowly loosening its grip. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if things would get better or stay the same. But for the first time in days, I felt okay with not knowing. When I reached the end of the loop, I sat down on a bench. I watched the sky gradually shift from blue to a subtle pink. I listened to the distant sounds of traffic, to the soft laughter of the boy on the bike, to the whisper of leaves swaying gently above me. A thought crossed my mind, simple and small, but important. Maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came in small moments like this, in quiet afternoons, in slow walks, in unexpected messages that remind you you're not alone. Maybe part of growing was learning to pause, learning to breathe, learning to sit with your feelings without letting them drown you. I stayed there until the sky dimmed and the streetlights flickered on. Then I stood up and began walking back home. This time, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I felt like I was walking towards something, even if I couldn't see what it was yet. When I reached my door, I took a deep breath before going inside. The house felt calm, almost welcoming. I went to my room and looked at the notebook on my bedside table. I didn't open it, but just seeing it there reminded me that I had a place to put my thoughts whenever the world felt too heavy again. That night, lay down with a softer heart. The worries didn't disappear, but they didn't feel as sharp. I knew there would still be hard days ahead, moments when everything felt uncertain again. But I also knew that something inside me was changing, strengthening, learning. As I closed my eyes, a quiet thought settled inside me, gentle and reassuring. Maybe tomorrow would be a little better. Maybe the day after that too. And even if it wasn't, I would keep going. Step by step, moment by moment, finding my way through whatever came next. And for the first time in a long while, that felt enough. The day of the court hearing arrived with a strange mix of tension and quiet hope. The main character woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen, unable to sleep any longer. They made a simple breakfast, but barely touched it. Their thoughts kept drifting back to everything that had led them to this point: the warnings, the fines, the arguments, the late nights gathering documents, the long conversations with neighbors, and the endless stress caused by the HOA leader's behavior. Even though they felt nervous, there was also a sense of calm determination. They knew they had done nothing wrong. They had followed the rules, stayed patient, and collected every piece of evidence with care. They weren't going to court to fight or argue. They were going to tell the truth. When the main character stepped outside, they saw a couple of neighbors watching from their porches. One gave a small wave. Another quietly mouthed, "Good luck." It made the main character feel less alone. For so long, it had felt like the whole neighborhood was under the HOA leader's shadow, each person afraid they might be targeted next. But now, something had shifted. They arrived at the courthouse early and sat in the waiting area. Their hands were cold, but their resolve stayed firm. They held a folder full of printed emails, photos, HOA documents, receipts, and letters from neighbors who had been mistreated but never felt brave enough to challenge the HOA leader themselves. All of it was stacked neatly, organized with sticky notes. Soon the HOA leader walked in with a loud, confident stride. She wore an expression that mixed irritation and pride. She acted like she had already won. She didn't even glance at the main character. Instead, she kept whispering to someone beside her, complaining about how much time and trouble the hearing was causing her. When the courtroom doors opened, everyone filed inside. The judge entered with a calm but firm presence. They reviewed the case file briefly before calling the hearing to order. From the very beginning, HOA leader tried to dominate the room. She spoke quickly, loudly, and insisted that she had done everything correctly. She said the main character had been nothing but trouble and accused them of breaking multiple rules. But when the judge asked for documentation, she couldn't provide any. She had brought a few loose papers, but none of them matched her claims. The main character stayed quiet until the judge turned to them. With a steady voice, they explained what had been happening in the neighborhood. They talked about the unreasonable fines, the warnings that didn't match the real HOA rules, and the constant harassment. Then they handed over the folder of evidence. One by one, the judge went through the documents. The printed emails showed the HOA leader threatening fines without proper notice. The photos showed the property in perfect condition on the days she claimed there were violations. The letters from neighbors described similar experiences and how they were. Afraid to speak up, the judge's expression shifted from neutral to puzzled, then slowly to concern. The more they read, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't a disagreement about rules. It was misuse of authority. The HOA leader began to panic. She interrupted several times, insisting the neighbors were lying or exaggerating. She tried to redirect the conversation, complaining about how hard her job was and how ungrateful everyone was. But the judge wasn't interested in excuses. They wanted facts, and the evidence spoke louder than any emotional outburst at one point. The judge asked a simple question. Where are the official records of board meetings where you claim new rules were voted on? The HOA leader froze. She looked through her papers, but there was nothing. The judge waited. Still nothing. Finally, she said, "I didn't think I needed to bring them." The judge raised an eyebrow. "If you change the rules without proper voting or documentation, those changes are not valid and may be unlawful." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Even a couple of neighbors who had shown up to watch exchanged looks. The main character didn't gloat, didn't smirk, and didn't celebrate. They sat still, listening carefully. They weren't there to win an argument. They only wanted fairness. The judge then called forward 3 neighbors who had agreed to speak in person. Each one shared a short, calm statement. They described how the HOA leader had fined them for things that were never mentioned in any rule book, like the color of a flower pot or the way a guest's car was parked for 10 minutes. They explained how they had been afraid to challenge her because she threatened further penalties. With every statement, the courtroom atmosphere shifted even more. What started as one person's complaint was now clearly a community issue. The judge leaned back in their chair, thinking quietly for a long moment. Everyone waited. After what felt like an hour, the judge spoke clearly and firmly. They explained that the evidence showed a repeated pattern of overreach and violation of proper HOA procedures. They pointed out missing records, unauthorized rule changes, unexplained fines, and the misuse of authority. They noted that the HOA leader had not followed the legal requirements for maintaining transparency and fairness. The court needed to determine whether the HOA could continue operating under such leadership or whether the entire organization was to compromise to remain in power. The HOA leader tried one last time to defend herself, talking over the judge and insisting everyone was exaggerating, but this only made things worse. The judge had already seen enough before giving the final ruling. The judge looked directly at the HOA leader and said, "An HOA exists to support a community, not to control or intimidate it." Those words echoed through the courtroom. The judge then announced their decision. The HOA would be placed under immediate legal review. All fines issued in the past year were to be frozen until the court completed its examination. The HOA leader was temporarily suspended from her position pending final judgment. A wave of relief moved through the room. Not in loud cheers, just quiet, grateful sighs. The main character felt their shoulders loosen for the first time in months. As the hearing ended, neighbors approached the main character to thank them. Some were emotional, saying they wished they had spoken up sooner. The main character didn't blame anyone. They understood how fear can keep people silent. When they walked out of the courthouse, the sun felt warmer. The air felt lighter. But the story wasn't over. The final decision was still to come, and the HOA leader clearly wasn't finished fighting. She walked out with a stiff expression, already whispering angrily into her phone. But something had changed. The community had seen the truth. The judge had seen the truth. And the main character had shown, through patience and persistence, that even someone acting alone can stand up to unfair power. With the court review underway, the neighborhood waited, and the main character prepared for whatever would come next, knowing that the hardest part, the part where they stood alone, was finally behind them. The days after the hearing felt strangely quiet in the neighborhood. People were living their normal lives, mowing their lawns, walking their dogs, chatting with neighbors, but something in the air felt different. The tension that had been hanging around for so long was finally fading. For the first time in months, the main character could step outside, without wondering what new issue the HOA leader was going to invent next. Even though the hearing had brought relief, there was still a final decision to come. The court's review would take time, and no one knew exactly how long. But the main character didn't spend those days waiting anxiously. Instead, they focused on rebuilding the calm they had lost, little piece by little piece. One morning, they decided to clean up their backyard. Not because the HOA had ever asked for it this time, it was simply for themselves. They trimmed the plants, swept the patio, and even bought a small set of outdoor lights to hang along the fence. It felt good to reclaim their space, to enjoy their home without feeling watched or judged. Neighbors began stopping by more often. A few brought homemade snacks. Others offered to help around the yard. Many just wanted to talk not about the HOA or the drama, but about normal things. It made the main character realize how much fear had kept everyone apart. Now that the pressure was lifted, people were reconnecting, laughing, sharing stories, and finally breathing freely. One evening, a small group gathered by the sidewalk. They talked about forming a new community board, something simple and fair. Nothing like the strict and controlling system they had been forced to follow before. They wanted transparency, kindness, and decisions made by everyone, not just one person who forced her own rules. The main character didn't push themselves into the leadership role, but everyone kept turning to them for guidance. After all, they were the one who had stood up first. As they all discussed ideas, the neighborhood felt brighter. Someone suggested organizing a small weekend get-together. Another offered to bring food. A third said they would make printed copies of whatever new guidelines the community would agree on together. It was the kind of unity no one had seen in a long time. But even with these positive changes, the main character knew the story wasn't fully over. The former HOA leader was still suspended, and no one had seen her around the neighborhood for days. People whispered about what she might be planning next, but the main character tried not to worry. They had been through the worst already. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was from the court. The main character held it for a moment before opening it, feeling that familiar tightness in their chest. But when they finally unfolded the papers inside, a long breath escaped them. The judge had completed the review. The decision was final. The HOA was officially dissolved. Every fine issued by the former leader was erased. Every warning she had given was declared invalid. The records showed she had changed rules without proper voting, used her position to intimidate residents, and failed to follow legal requirements for transparency. With all of that, the judge ruled that the HOA could not continue under its current structure. The main character read the decision twice, just to make sure they understood it correctly. The words were clear, firm, and fair. The HO as something that had caused so much stress, division, and unnecessary conflict was gone. They stepped outside holding the letter. A neighbor saw them and came over, asking carefully, "Is it good news?" The main character nodded and handed them the papers. The neighbor's eyes widened. They called out to another neighbor, who hurried over. Soon, word spread down the street. People stepped out of their homes, gathering in small groups, talking in excited voices. You could feel the relief spreading like a weight lifting off everyone's shoulders. Some people cheered quietly. Some laughed. Some just stared at the letter in disbelief. A few even looked emotionally, not because they were sad, but because they finally felt free. The main character didn't make a big speech. They didn't need to. Their calm smile said enough. That evening, the neighborhood felt more alive than it had in years. Kids played outside without anyone worrying about being told to stop. A couple set out chairs and chatted with people walking by. Someone grilled food and offered some to anyone passing. It felt like a real community again. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the main character walked slowly down the street. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange. They passed houses that looked calmer now, no longer under constant surveillance from an overzealous leader. The gardens, the driveways, the porches all looked like pieces of a neighborhood finally reclaiming peace. They ended up standing near the small park. A light breeze brushed past, carrying the scent of fresh grass. The quiet of the evening felt warm, not empty. The world felt gentle again. They sat on a bench and let themselves reflect on everything. They remembered the days of receiving unfair warnings, the stress of constant accusations, the anxiety that came every time they saw an envelope from the HOA. They thought about the months of feeling alone in a fight they never asked for. But then they also remembered the turning points, the small moments of support from neighbors, the courage it took to gather evidence, the strength to walk into the courthouse, and the relief when the truth finally came out. Looking back, the journey hadn't just changed the neighborhood. It had changed the main character, too. It showed them what patience, persistence, and quiet bravery could do. It reminded them that speaking up, even when it's difficult, can bring light to the whole community. While they sat there, a neighbor approached and sat beside them. After a moment of comfortable silence, the neighbor said, "You know, none of this would have happened without you." The main character shook their head gently. "Everyone played a part." "Maybe," the neighbor replied, "but you were the first one who refused to be pushed around. You didn't let fear stop you." The main character didn't argue. They simply smiled, appreciating the words without letting them inflate their ego. They didn't fight for recognition. They fought because it was the right thing to do. As the stars began appearing in the sky, the neighbor stood up and said goodnight. The main character stayed a little longer, watching the quiet street and thinking about what lay ahead. Without the HOA controlling every decision, the community could build something new, something fair and friendly. They knew there would be challenges. Any group of people would have disagreements. But now, those disagreements would be handled together, with kindness, not fear. When they finally walked home, streetlights glowed softly along the road. A couple of houses still had people chatting on the porch. Someone waved. They waved back. It felt like home again, inside their house. The main character placed the court decision in a drawer, not out of fear, but as a reminder that fairness matters, that standing up matters, that people, when brought together, can change even the most difficult situation. Before going to bed, they stepped outside one last time. The night felt calm, peaceful, real. They took a deep breath, feeling gratitude for the journey, even the difficult parts. Because every step, every moment of doubt, every challenge, every victory had brought them right here. And this time, the neighborhood truly belonged to the people who lived in it. The long fight was finally over, and a new, hopeful chapter was already beginning.